preservation. My name is Marilyn Nusky, and our co-host is Renee Neubauer. Hi, Renee.
Hi, Marilyn.
This webinar is to discuss Brumby protection and conservation in Australia, which is at an absolutely critical point. Brumbies are being targeted for destruction, despite having been living in the Australian environment for nearly 200 years. Brumby advocates, if we want to stop Brumby populations being destroyed and treated inhumanely, we need informed knowledge to be empowered to challenge those who want to eradicate them. We need to engage with research and learn from those with experience and knowledge about how Brumbies add value to the environment and about trialled, humane and sustainable population control, its drawbacks and advantages. In these ways, we could all be empowered to address the issue of humane Brumby conservation in more meaningful ways. Most will have heard about our panelists, Arian Wallach and Scott Beckstead, two experts in the field of animal conservation who have kindly agreed to panel this very important groundbreaking Q&A forum in Australia. We thank you both for giving your time. And I'll now introduce our panelists. We have Arian Wallach, is an ecologist based at the Centre for Compassionate Conservation, Faculty of Science, University of Technology, Sydney. She works to protect wildlife from killing programs in conservation, farming and commercial practices, and has collaborated with landholders to create safe areas for persecuted species. Her ecological research reveals how non-native species promote biodiversity and how apex predators enable native-non-native coexistence. She is spearheading the field of compassionate conservation, which is based on the ethical position that actions taken to protect biodiversity should be guided by compassion for all sentient beings. Scott Beckstead serves as the Rural Outreach Director at the Humane Society of the United States. Shortly after coming to work for the HSUS in 2008, he worked at HSUS Oregon State Director to pass a number of animal welfare bills in the Oregon legislature, including measures to regulate puppy mills and the tethering of dogs, shark finning, and the cruel practice of horse tripping. He also led successful statewide ballot measure campaigns to protect Oregon wildlife and ban the trafficking in endangered species. Throughout Scott's tenure with HSUS, Scott has worked extensively on protecting equine from cruelty and slaughter and continues to be part of the HSUS fight to pass the SAFE Act to ban the slaughter of American horses for human consumption. Before working for the HSUS, Scott owned and operated a law firm in the coastal town of Waldport, where he also served as the mayor for several years. In 2000, he and three co-authors published the first textbook on animal law. He has taught animal law, wildlife law, and Endangered Species Act classes at Willamette Uni College of Law since 2010. I'll now hand over to Renee to start the questions.
Thanks, Marilyn, and certainly, welcome to Arian and Scott and all of the attendees that we have. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for sending in their questions. There was a lot of questions submitted into Arian and Scott. I've had to summarise the questions so we can get a really good broad scope of the range of questions asked in the hour that we have. So if you have any questions during the responses that you are given by Arian and Scott, you can please do that by the little Q&A tab underneath. So I will alternate the questions between our two panellists, and I'm going to get going with Arian first. And the question to you, Arian, is from Craig Downer, and it's a follow-on question by Tess. Craig Downer asks, do Brumbies harm or benefit the ecosystem in Australia? The second part of that question is from Tess, and she would like to know, could the eradication of the Brumbies actually harm native species?
Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me and for all these questions, and these are certainly good ones. They're complex questions, and they get at the heart of what conservation is about. What is the good that conservation is about? What does it mean to harm or benefit an ecosystem? Sometimes we like to think about ecosystems as if we're thinking about our own bodies. And if we get sick, obviously we're sick, and if we're feeling well, then we're healthy. And we make this kind of leap between thinking about our bodies and thinking about the world. And of course, during COVID, there's an easy tendency to think about a virus coming into our body and disrupting the harmony, the works of our bodies. And then imagine something making a kind of metaphoric connection of having Brumbies coming into an ecosystem and disrupting the harmony of that system. And the problem is that comparison actually is false. Ecosystems are not enclosed bodies. And they're this kind of idea of this balance of nature, this kind of equilibrium that is maintained in a very fine way, like an individual's body. It's just not how ecology works. Ecology is extremely dynamic and it changes all the time. So when you have a new species added into an ecosystem, what happens is, like any other living creature, there will be individuals and species that do really well, and individuals and species that do less well. And that's true of any living creature. All living beings, whether they're native or not, are going to create stresses on others and going to create opportunities and benefits for others. We have a particular mindset, though, that because Brumbies are not native, that there's something unique about the kind of stresses and opportunities that they form in the ecology. One way, though, to kind of break out of that way of thinking is to think about the biodiversity of a particular landscape in longer terms. So, for example, Australia used to be full of big beasts, so we call megafauna. They went extinct 10 to 50,000 years ago. And they used to perform all sorts of ecological functions that were lost when they went extinct. And they possibly did go extinct because of human hunting. And some of the research that we've done, particularly led by Eric Lundgren, who's finishing his PhD now, is that animals such as Brumbies are actually filling in ecological functions that were lost in the Pleistocene. There's this idea, for example, that Brumbies, or there's this, that Brumbies and other ungulates have hard hoofs that the Australian ecosystem has never encountered before. But that's actually not true. In the past, there were big beasts with hoof-like feet. The flat-faced kangaroos, for example, there are at least 200 kilogram, literally flat-faced kangaroos that could not hop, they walked. There's also a lot of similarities between Brumbies and extinct giant wombats. So if we expand this view, we can kind of, it just very much depends on the perspective. And we can say that the Brumby, in one extent, is this new thing in the Australian landscape. And on the other hand, it's actually quite an old thing.
Right. Well, that certainly gives a lot more in-depth knowledge to what I ever thought was possible. So thanks for that, Arian. I'm sure Tess and Craig will get their responses and answers to that pretty good. Scott, on to you next. We have a question from Ellie, and it's in regards to wanting to find out the latest use of immunocontraception in wild horses. First part of her question is, how long has it been used for in the USA? And has it been successful in any significant decreases in populations?
Well, thank you, Renee, and it's an honor to be joining you here from Oregon. I just by way of a little bit of history, in 1971, in a response to growing public awareness of the mistreatment of American wild mustangs, the Congress passed and President Nixon signed into law the Wild Free Roaming Horse and Burro Act. That vested management authority of the wild horses and burros in the Western United States with the Bureau of Land Management, which is a political subdivision of the Department of Interior. The BLM manages millions upon millions of acres of public lands, primarily in the Western United States. It caters to a host of stakeholders that includes the mining industry, the gas industry, the oil industry, the livestock industry, and also the public who likes to enjoy public lands recreationally. But the BLM was vested with the authority to manage the wild horse and burro population, but Congress was very specific that the whole point was for the BLM to manage these animals humanely, using humane management techniques. And so with that in mind, beginning in the 1970s, the BLM started looking at ways to control the population of wild horses and burros, and a variety of fertility control methods were considered, including chemical vasectomies and others. But ultimately, it was in the 1990s that the BLM agreed to start using PZP, which is an immunocontraceptive that essentially forms a coating around the ovum of the mare and prevents that ovum from being fertilized. What's great about PZP is that it does not in any way impede the natural behaviors of the wild horses and burros. They still engage in mating behaviors. It's just that the stallion sperm is not able to fertilize that ovum. It is a vaccine, and so it is of limited duration. Typically, a mare that is given PZP is incapable of getting pregnant for 1 to 2 years. Now, there is research and studies being done right now to increase the efficacy and the duration of the effect of PZP. So that work is being done and hopefully will be forthcoming soon. But the problem is that the BLM has historically listened to the wishes of the livestock industry over the wishes of the American public. And, you know, it's often joked that 80,000 Americans don't hold water compared to one pissed off rancher. And that's really that's a pretty accurate way of summing up the BLM's priorities. So the BLM has used fertility control primarily as a token gesture, so that they say to the American public, hey, we're trying this stuff, but really, if we want to remove large numbers of horses, or we really want to get at population management, we need to do these gathers and removals, which is a double speak for roundups. The wild horse advocacy community and the animal welfare community here in the United States has pushed for a broader, more extensive use of fertility control by the BLM. It really is a question, though, of political will. And it is true that fertility control thus far has not proven to be an efficient way of reducing or managing the population. But that's not because it doesn't work. It's because the BLM doesn't use it to the extent that it should. And we have been trying very hard to get the BLM to start using fertility control aggressively, uniformly, and consistently on all of the wild herds. But as of yet, it's, the BLM just would much prefer to just use the helicopters and round up the animals and not use the fertility control as anything other than, like I said, pretty much a political gesture.
Right. Well, that pretty much, you know, sums up what's going on here in Australia as well. I mean, we don't have the access to PZP to be used here. And yeah, the tack that the government is certainly taking is, you know, using a bullet and sending off to slaughter in abattoirs rather than looking at alternative methods. And this is why it's really important to have these discussions on both sides, because we're at a point now in our country where we can try and form some better thought processes and legislation to have these Brumbies put in a better view. Because what you're saying now about Brumbies, about the Mustangs having the immunocontraception hasn't really impacted because of it not being used widely or correctly. So as a country, I mean, Ellie would also like to know, you know, how could we look at potentially beginning those programs here?
Well, yeah, and that question, it really strikes at the heart of the issue, because it really is, it's not an issue of does contraceptive or contraception work or fertility control work. It's a question of how do you get government to buy into the program and start using it, and using it in a way that's going to work. That's been the big challenge here in the United States, is getting, you know, really significant buy-in. And it really, what it comes down to is politics. Finding sympathetic lawmakers at the federal level who care about the Brumbies, I think, is going to be key. And then getting getting those lawmakers to influence the agencies in Australia that are overseeing the Brumbies, and creating political pressure. And of course, a lot of it too is they need to hear from people that care, and people that are invested in the issue. But like I said, you know, it's kind of a running joke here in the United States that 80,000 Americans don't have the same pull as one pissed off rancher. And that's just kind of how it is.
Yeah.
Could I just ask one very quick question, Scott? So it's not actually, is it actually in legislation in America that immunocontraception be used? It is not yet legislated. Is that the case?
Correct. That's
okay.
correct.
That's okay. And that's what we are pushing for here, to have legislation with a panel of managers or advisors to the government. And that is what we want to see enacted here. Interesting. Sorry, Renee.
And very, very briefly, because I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but here in the United States, it's very often a spending issue with the government.
Okay.
So,
Yep.
Congress allocated, a bunch of money to the BLM to manage wild horses and burros, and then advocates went in with some sympathetic and supportive lawmakers and introduced an amendment that said of that amount, 11 million has to be used by the BLM on fertility control.
Okay.
So, which is a huge victory, because originally they were just told, here's a bunch of money, go manage the wild horses and burros. And then we stepped forward and said, but wait, you're going to take 11 million of this sum and you're going to use it solely on the use of fertility control. So that sort of forced the BLM's hand. Now they're assuming the Senate approves that same amendment, then it's the BLM's going to have no choice but to spend $11 billion on.
I'm just going to have to interrupt here. Sorry to cut you short, because I'm just going to be mindful of the clock, and we've got a few more questions to get through. And I know there's quite a few that would like to ask Arian some questions from Sandy. So we can come back if we've got more time left to address more of this PZP issues. Arian, Sandy wants to know, can apex predators like dingoes influence wild horses in their densities and ecology?
And thank you for the question. That's very much close to my research passion, are apex predators and dingoes in particular. At this point, I would have to say we don't really know, but I can share that there are some hopeful signs. We have some hopeful data from Australia, and we have some very hopeful data from North America. There's certainly predation that's happening. There's no question. Dingoes can predate on wild horses. I've actually witnessed the aftermath of killing of a wild foal in northern South Australia. And we know that there are, in parts of the United States, cougars hunt wild horses, and they certainly, in one of our field sites, they are regularly hunting wild donkeys, which are quite similar in some respects. So I can't say that yet we have scientific evidence to show this, but just think about it this way. If you've ever just walked into an area, let's say with your dog, go for a walk with your dog into a place where there are cows or horses that you may encounter, the reaction that they have is, unless they've learned to be very comfortable with people and dogs, is to be extremely wary, which is really odd because they are so much larger than us. And if you're just walking, let's say, one human being with one dog, what really could we possibly do? Or even just watch a herd of cows, just encountering one or two dogs. The response is very, very strong. And it doesn't make sense because two dogs cannot do anything to a large cow or a large horse. There are, I think, certain reasons for that response. One is that their calves are susceptible, very susceptible to dingoes and other big predators. And the mothers are going to make decisions about how they move in the landscape and when they're active and where they go to, based on that on that risk to their calves. The males then are going to have to make decisions based on what the females are doing. And so you have an entire society where not everyone is vulnerable to predation, but it's enough that some are vulnerable to predation, that will actually change the ecology. So I would say that there's circumstantial evidence, and it makes sense that there's this strong interaction, and that we're doing the research now to look at these kinds of interactions, and there's hopeful data. But wait and see. Hopefully, if we have another webinar in a year or so, be able to be more explicit.
Yeah. Ariane, a question's just quickly come up from Sylvianne. I don't know, can you see a question down there if you click?
It may be just easier if you read it out.
Oh, okay. Well, it's just disappeared. Oh,
I think, are you meaning the question about Fraser Island?
Yes.
I actually answered it. I think Arian has basically broadly answered that question. That's why it did change the ecological balance on the island. There is absolutely no doubt. And so that's why I answered the question.
Thanks, Marilyn. Ariane, stay with us. I've got another question from Joanne Canning. Is the management of non-native species even necessary? Would it be better just not to interfere?
So that's like almost a taboo thing to say, particularly in Australia. One of the things that are the most perhaps frightening things in the world for human beings is not to act and not to manage and not to feel like we're in control of the universe and beyond. It's a difficult thing. I would say that 9 out of 10, the best thing to do is not to do in nearly all situations. There's very few situations in which there are interactions between species that are so problematic that one of these species is going to go extinct, or some kind of interaction that one of these is going to go extinct. If you consider the sheer number of, for example, non-native species that exist, and they're everywhere. You have to think of plants and birds and fish and bacteria and worms, and the world is very dynamic, and most of them we don't know anything about. We're very focused on those that we notice, and we usually notice them because they bother us in some way, or because they're very charismatic. And horses kind of have this double whammy, that they're very noticeable to us. And if you're a rancher, or in Australia, if you're a conservationist, they do things that are very noticeable. And if you have a particular predilection that, for example, anything that a Brumby does is a bad thing. That is, if they're stomping around and they're making a place look muddy, or they're, you know, then, and that's not how you grew up seeing that place, and that mud is no longer okay. But if you go to Africa and you see that same mud created by megafauna, then that's okay. So I would say that one thing that I find is a useful guide, and we've, in the compassionate conservation community, we've adopted is from medical bioethics, which is first do no harm. So first do no harm is what a doctor, if you go to a doctor and you're coughing, or you have an infection in a wound on your leg or something like that. Let's take the infection on your leg, for example. They're not going to cut your leg off because you have a wound on your leg, right? They're going to start with the least invasive thing that they possibly can do, because any medical intervention could actually make the patient worse off. And doctors are very aware of that and very careful that if they're going to intervene in someone's body, make sure that you're not actually making someone worse off. Even if you can't make them better, try not to make them worse off. And very often interventions backfire, and backfire badly. So we go out with this intention of fixing a problem, and then we either create new problems, or we make the problem that we're trying to fix worse. Yeah. And it's not surprising, because ecosystems are infinitely complex. And a gun is not the most dexterous, I hope that's the correct word, the most dexterous instrument that you can use when you're trying to create a kind of interaction with the world. I think what we should do is kind of think differently and say, okay, if there's a system where there is clearly some kind of problem and we want to help, and we're willing to help, then let's see what we can do first in our own behavior to make this problem improve. You know, maybe if there's a situation with Brumbies or Mustangs and and there's very low vegetation, the vegetation is getting grazed to very low levels, well, maybe we could decide to have less commercial cattle, for example, in the system. For example, that's something we can control. It's a very dangerous thing when we try and control the lives of others. We tend to make a lot of mistakes, and there's also serious moral problems. It's a bit like, imagine one nation controlling the behavior of another nation. We need to be very careful when we make those kinds of decisions. It's not to say that you never do. We often help. There's a help that happens between different nations and different societies, and sometimes there's even some force that is applied between societies. But generally, we try to give others the dignity of their autonomy and decisions, and very careful about intervening in others' lives. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Arian. That certainly has given, a lot of depth to that question, so thanks. Scott, you've got another question here from Sandy, and she wants to know, what were the challenges in terms of administrating the immunocontraception to the wild horses? What are some of the areas that are problematic?
Well, I would say the answer to that question is twofold. The first is what I've already referred to as sort of the lack of political will on the part of the Bureau of Land Management. The other agency that manages wild horses here in the United States is the United States Forest Service. Both of these agencies are responsible for managing the populations, and there has been a long-standing effort to get both to use the immunocontraceptive. So number one, political lack of political will. But second, I would say, is just, some of these herds in the United States live in extremely remote and very, very rugged country. And so darting them is very difficult. Lots of times herds in these really remote areas tend to be extremely wild, extremely wary of humans, extremely difficult to to get close enough to do the darting. That's not to say it can't be done. I believe that even those really difficult herds, those really remote wild herds, can be darted. One thing that I'd like to mention here just is that what is picking up steam in the United States is the use of volunteer groups who are specially trained in the use of the darting guns, who understand how to approach these horses, how to dart them, and they keep meticulous records of who's been darted, who has yet to be darted, who's related to who is in whose band, and so forth. And so I think that's actually probably going to increase here in the United States, the use of volunteer groups, because I think, frankly, the BLM doesn't really want to manage horses, and to the extent that groups of volunteers who care about these animals are willing to step up and do their work for them, I think the BLM is more than happy to let that happen, and certainly it saves a lot of taxpayer dollars as well.
Right, so these volunteers, it is funded through themselves, they don't get any assistance from the agencies?
They are provided with the contraceptive and the equipment from the BLM, and then but there are specially trained darters that actually train the other volunteers on how to do it. And like the Virginia Range herd, which lives just outside of Reno, Nevada, is a wonderful example of a herd that has been successfully managed by volunteers. The other one that I think is a really good example are the Salt River horses, who are these semi-aquatic horses that live along the Salt River in Arizona. Both of those herds have these very active and very engaged and very committed groups of volunteers who have basically taken over the management of those herds from the BLM and from the United States Forest Service.
Yeah. Well, I guess, if they're in that remoter location, what problem are they really doing to the wider spread environment if they're just isolated?
I agree, but you know what? If you're a public lands cattle rancher, all you're going to see is a bunch of animals eating grass that should be fattening your cattle and sheep. So that's the reality that you're up against.
Scott, we just had one question come through, and I'll try to make this very brief, from Sandy. So the recently announcement of a trial of another type of fertility control, which can render a mare infertile, is that just a political move? Or is it more appealing to cause infertility rather than a reversible vaccine? That's a double whammy, isn't it? But we're really running out of time.
That's a very it's a multi-layered question that I could probably talk for the next 3 or 4 hours about. But on the other hand, I am not super familiar with the new drug that's being tested. But I know that there is a broad public opposition to permanent sterilization of American wild horses and burros. I think that people would prefer that the effect be reversible. And so the BLM has tried these surgical, very invasive, horrible procedures on wild mares. And they've been shut down twice by the courts. The 2 universities who were originally partnering with the BLM backed out because of the public backlash. The BLM says that it's still committed to using that invasive surgical technique on wild mares. It's probably going to just lead to more litigation to try and get them stopped. But I would say that there's probably more promise in improving the existing drugs so that they have a longer life in the body of the mare, yet are still can be reversible, or the effects wear off. Because I think most Americans want to see wild horses behaving naturally, and
absolutely,
and
that's right.
And of course, a lot of it too goes to the genetic viability of the herds.
Thanks.
I'm going to be the timekeeper here.
Yeah, good on you, Marilyn. Thank you.
Marielle.
Ariane, we've got a question from Helen. She wants to know about invasion biology and that it's highly influential on conservation science and policy in Australia. Are there any groups or individuals critiquing invasion biology and offering alternative views?
Big time, actually.
Okay.
It may not feel like that in Australia, but I think it's important to bear in mind that conservation is a cultural practice, and different countries, different cultures, different societies have different ideas of what conservation is, and whether they even have a word that means conservation. Someone had to come up with a term. Invasion biology is extremely influential in Australia. It's not extremely influential everywhere, certainly not at the level that it is here. In fact, in Australia, conservation biology and invasion biology are almost the same thing. If you walk into a national park, nearly every national park in this country is going to be poison baited. There's a war against foxes. There's this shooting and rounding up of brumbies. So if a conservationist is going to do something, in Australia, generally doing something means killing someone. But that's not the conservation that I grew up with. I'm not, you may hear, I'm not originally from Australia. I've grown up in Israel, and in Israel, I actually, as an undergraduate and as a master's student, I hadn't even heard of invasion biology. It's starting to pick up there, unfortunately, in my view, now. But it's ideas that are coming from places like Australia, New Zealand, certain parts of the United States. Not all of the United States is as invasion biology leaning. There are a lot of academics from different disciplines around the world, including in Australia. I'm one, that critique invasion biology. They come from, they're ecologists, they're conservation biologists, they're philosophers, they're historians, they're wildlife biologists, botanists, many fields, evolutionary biologists as well in particular, and paleontologists. So in fact, it may be true to say that invasion biology has become now the most critiqued aspect of conservation biology as a subfield of conservation biology. Even though it's extremely influential in policy, and it feels like you can't even imagine now a conservation in this country without thinking about the world in terms of native and non-native. It's like such an important construct. But bear in mind that someone invented the word native and started using it one day. It's not just the way humans always thought. So humans were moving species well before they started defining them in this particular way. So yes, there are critiques. In my view, invasion biology is probably the worst idea to have come out of conservation biology. But it's also an extremely interesting one, because if you go through the waters of invasion biology, as I have, and come out on the other side questioning it, it gives you an opportunity to start questioning all sorts of assumptions about humanity itself. Because if ever there's a species that environmentalists think of as invasive species, it's human beings. And so giving up on invasion biology also can help us give up on the idea that we ourselves, human beings, are invasive species, that we ourselves are alien from some other planet, and that everything that we do, we think in the same way, just like we do with Brumbies. Everything that Brumbies do is a bad thing. It shouldn't be there. It's disrupting the harmony of nature. And the same thing about human beings. And that's a very, very problematic thing to deal with, because if we are just another animal on the block, then how do we think about what kind of relationships with the world, with the more than human world, that we want to have? It opens a lot of really interesting questions. So from that point of view, I'd say that invasion biology is really, really good at getting us to think critically about what it means to be a conservationist, environmentalist, someone who cares about the lives of non-human beings. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I guess it's all what we perceive as being normal with natives and non-natives, you know.
Arian, do you want to address very briefly, Sandy has raised the issue of trophic cascades, where we have compensatory reproduction, where species have been destroyed. Do you want to talk briefly about that, if it's possible, or should we move on? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, it kind of relates to the question again about apex predators. I would just say that when it comes, for example, to Brumbies, the very first thing that should be done, in my view, if there's any issue with Brumbies, or a feeling even of an issue of Brumbies, is stop poison baiting predators. Even if you don't believe that dingoes can do what they can do, if you are mass slaughtering dingoes, or you're mass slaughtering cougars or wolves in other parts of the world, then you're not even giving them a chance. And if you want to see if dingoes can even hunt an animal like a Brumby, you actually have to give them time. They need to be able to form territories and packs and develop the skills and expertise to become Brumby hunters.
Yeah.
It's not just something that, you know, any pup can do. They need to learn how to do it.
Yeah, thanks, Ariane. Scott, there was 2 questions from Helen, but you've already answered her first part in quite a bit of detail previously, so I'll just go straight to her second part. She would like to know what your thoughts are on the 2 ways to view invasive species. That of Fred Pearce, the new wild, where invasive species are the new salvation, or David Simbaloff, that all invasive species are aliens. Oh, you might need to unmute. Scott, unmute.
It's showing he can speak, so I don't know what's happened.
Okay.
Ariane, have you? Okay, Scott?
We've lost the audio on Scott.
I don't know why.
We can see you but can't hear you.
How about I take that question? Oh, until we can hear Scott. Scott, just interject, and I'll just respond to that. I've managed to. So yeah, Scott can work on his audio. I'd be really interested to hear from Scott about that question as well. We actually held a conference, and we had Fred Pearce as one of the guest speakers, and Daniel Simberloff is certainly a very established figure in invasion biology. He's one of the leading figures, and I think it's interesting point to choose between these kind of 2 figures is that it does kind of, there is a certain split in the academic community between those that think of the world in terms of native and non-native, like Daniel Simberloff, in where you would say in its most extreme form, guilty until proven otherwise. That is, any species that is not native is by definition either harmful or potentially harmful. And on the other side of the scale, which I certainly, my research and my kind of ethical predilections also tend to lead me to, is that is this idea that actually it's making the world a lot more biodiverse. And I'll say something controversial here. Like one of the studies that we published recently actually shows that, I mean, it's well known worldwide that Australia has experienced a mass extinction, particularly of mammals. But at the same time, the actual number of mammals and vertebrates in general in this country has actually gone up, because there are more introduced species than there are those that have gone extinct. That's morally a really tricky thing. But also bear in mind that many of these species, if you were just to look at their native ranges, are threatened species. If we take horses, for example, organizations like the IUCN list horses as an endangered species. And that's because horses are only considered proper wildlife in Mongolia. All of the horses around the world don't count in that worldview. But there's a lot of kind of taxonomy and ethics that come to play in whether you would consider horses to be an endangered species or a really flourishing one, or we're actually seeing the birth of new species. I mean, there's the horse in Mongolia, the Mustang in North America, and the Brumby in Australia. Are these essentially baby species that are starting to emerge? In which case you can argue that what we're seeing is an extraordinary speciation that's occurring. And I hope, Scott, that your audio is back.
Can you talk, Scott? Oh no.
Oh no, he's okay from this end. I don't know what's happening, and it shows he's not muted. Oh, Scott.
Oh, Scott.
Oh, Scott.
Okay, well, we'll just have to press
maybe
on.
maybe just worth logging out and logging back in, and hopefully that will fix it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So perhaps we move on with the next question for Ariane while Scott works
Or maybe
out.
we can take some. We could take some of the questions that have been coming in.
Okay. Well, some of the questions that have been coming in, and I'll find there were some for. Now I've got to find my little cursor here. Where there was the compensatory trophic cascade style of question. One interesting question, and I'm not sure, it was really arose from what Scott was saying, and it's about what would the speakers consider to be the path forward with Australian research and trials, an anticipated timeline, I'm assuming timeline for immunocontraception to actually start working, and estimated costs. And I'm assuming that means in comparison with the cost of eradication, which, as we all know, are multi-millions of dollars. I guess it's a percentage cost. Is it more cost efficient, for want of a better word, to use some style of population control, whether it be PZP or other, rather than PZP or whatever? So is that clear? Is that got lost myself there?
Yeah, I think so. But can we see if Scott's audio is back?
Scott, can you speak?
Oh no!
Oh no. Okay.
I don't know what's going on.
It 5 minutes.
Seems like it's 5 minutes left to
till 10 o'clock, till 11. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Scott, if you could interject whenever you can, and hopefully it must be a mic problem. There's nothing like having these things on Zoom. On the one hand, they're wonderful. We can. Oh, you're back.
You're back. Talk up.
Well, I just, we don't have a ton of time, but I wanted to just say a couple things. First of all, I totally agree with what Arian is saying, because, we have a highly invasive species here in Oregon called the Himalayan blackberry. And I spend a couple hours every day out in the forest with my dogs. And I can tell you that at this time of year, everyone is eating the blackberries. Everyone, including me. And, it's like when people are worried about how the black bears are doing, or people are wondering, how the deer are doing, or whatever, the birds, at least they have the blackberries. And so I kind of agree that, environmentalists think of the invasive species and on the one hand, it's easy to understand, where they're coming from. But on the other hand, like here in North America, this is the continent where horses evolved. They were eradicated at the end of the last ice age by human hunters, and then reintroduced, several thousand years later by Europeans. And so are they truly an invasive species, or are they a reintroduced native species? Now, depending on who you talk to, they're, a completely different animal, and so they shouldn't be considered native. But on the other hand, they are the very same genus as the animals that once, roamed around here en masse. So
yeah. Scott, while you've got the audio, just got one last question. It's actually from me. We often talk about sustainable numbers of brumbies for the ecosystem, but what would be a sustainable number of brumbies in a mob so they are genetically viable?
Well, it's really going to depend on the area where the herd lives, because there are some ecosystems here in the Western United States that are very lush and verdant and can support a lot more wild horses and burros than an area where it's just really, desert. And so, the topography and the characteristics of the landscape are going to determine what that viable number is. But yes, I mean, for example, the BLM is now on this rampage to round up and reduce as many herds as they possibly can before this administration comes to an end. And so unfortunately, they're talking about taking some of these herds down to a number that is below genetic viability. And, the National Academy of Sciences in 2013 told the BLM, you're taking too many horses off the range. You're going to make it so that these herds go extinct because they're going to lose their genetic variability. But the BLM doesn't listen to the National Academy of Science.
Yeah. So what sort of number would they be talking for genetic viability then, Scott, in that situation?
Well, again, it depends on what the landscape can support. But I mean, typically, like for example, there's a herd now that they are taking down to 50 wild horses. That is way below the number that we recommend. Of 200 wild horses for genetic viability, and the BLM wants to take it down to 50, and that is a prescription for extinction for that herd.
Okay, well answered. Marilyn?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just wanted, there had been a question that's come through, Ellie, and it was directed toward Ariane, and that is about if we do remove population control, how will that impact vulnerable and threatened species? Will we see threatened species disappear?
We've got under 1 minute.
While evolving.
I'll answer.
Yeah. And the second part of that question from me is how do you feel about the use of immunocontraception per se, like PZP? That's big, I know.
Yeah, those are two big questions. I think that in regard to the second one, that does relate to what I was expressing earlier about treating others' agency very seriously and needing to have a very, very good reason to take over the lives of others. That's kind of principle that I would start with. In terms of what will happen if we just left horses alone, at the moment there's no evidence that horses are driving anyone extinct. So that's really important. That's important to bear in mind. They can have suppressive effects on certain species, and in most cases, even it's more complicated than species A driving species B extinct. There's often an ecological interaction. So I would say that it would be worthwhile to find out what ecology looks like when we don't kill wildlife.
Okay. Well, Scott had to go because he's doing his first lecture for the semester at university. So goodbye, Scott.
Goodbye, Scott.
Marilyn, do you want to quickly wrap up before we get bumped off?
Okay, so do we have any more questions, Renee? Is there any more questions?
No
more for Ariane?
We've pretty much got it down to...
We got in on the wire, hey? Look,
Yeah.
I just want to, well, Scott's gone, but we'll thank him. Thank you, Scott and Ariane, for being on the panel today and for taking the time to answer our questions. And for all the people who have come as guests, thank you for coming. And I just want to please remind you all to keep an eye on the social media page, Brumby Action Group, because as you know, we are trying to get legislation in Victoria, at least, to protect Victorian Brumbies that are under threat. And we need your support with that. We need you to keep signing the petitions. There is a bill that has been, is still in draft with a few late minute changes, but seeking politicians who will support that and introduce it into Parliament, hopefully this year. So please keep an eye out on that. The other thing is, Scott mentioned earlier that he would be willing to engage in further webinars, and I think that's a brilliant idea. Ariane, if you might be willing to at least think about it. And maybe some of those questions that didn't achieve answers today, we can readdress those questions with a bit more time. I see there's a couple. I won't, thanks everyone. That's lovely, Sandy. And thanks Marilyn and Nay and Scott and Ariane. Well, that's wonderful. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we certainly have achieved something that hasn't been done before in the Brumby groups of people in Australia. So I think, you know, maybe next time we make it a specific topic so we can further delve into more depth in the responses. But it's been great.
Yep. So it's the end.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ariane, thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you for having me and for all the questions.
Always a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye, Ariane. Bye.
Bye, Marilyn. And to all the attendees.
Bye.
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 Bye. I'm going to end now. Bye.